Morning, folks. How are you? Good to see you. Thank you, Jeremy. Appreciate that. We finished up this lengthy series on the Judges. Last week we talked about Samson. This is the second half of that. Samson is the last of the judges mentioned in the book. Okay? So from this point on, then you have kings that take over. God puts in place kings to kind of rule over and lead the nation of Israel beyond this. And in all of the judges, there are certain things I think that we notice in those. And part of that, of course, is the idea that none of them were perfect by any means. Every one of them failed, and failed miserably in most cases. And yet God uses them in spite of all their failures. And that's been the idea behind this series, is you can make a difference. No matter what, you can have an impact on those that are around you. You can have influence in your circle of friends, or even beyond your circle of friends. There is opportunity for you to impact and have influence on other individuals, no matter what. And so even in Samson's case, that's the way that this is. As we talked last week, usually if we just mention the name, there is this mental picture that comes in that you have of this strong man, and we recognize Samson based of nothing more on his strength, and yet we really can relate to Samson more not about his strength but about his weaknesses. His failures are actually things that we can kind of relate to maybe more than the fact that he was a strong man. Now, if I were to give you a test, jump up to the next slide there, because I want to give you a test. You won't be graded on this. You won't have to stand before the throne of God or anything and give answers to this. But if we were doing an attitude or an emotion test, we associate certain attitudes or emotions with color. Okay? So if we think red, we think red and angry. Okay? We think anger. All right? So now you know the idea of what it is. So we think red, we think anger. If we think green, what do we say? Green with envy. All right? We think green with envy is one of the things that are mentioned. We think white. White usually comes based on what? If I'm frightened, I become white as a sheet. Okay? We've heard that phrase before. I become white as a sheet if I'm frightened. Okay? Or if I think in terms of the idea of blue, that would be what? Broken-hearted, you get blue, right? You become blue and all of that. Some kind of disappointment, right? Or we might think, we didn't put one up there, but we'll add another one. What about yellow? Yellow is kind of associated with what? Being cowardly, right? I mean, the idea of being yellow. You're yellow. You're cowardly. Or black. Black's going to bring us beyond even angry to revenge. Okay? It moves us beyond even being angry to being vengeful or revenge. And that really is kind of what we look at here in terms of the futility of revenge. And we spend a lot of time in our world of today trying to get revenge. Samson did in most all of his adult life. It never paid off for him. It never paid off for him. When I think about the idea of vengeance or revenge, it comes in all shapes and sizes. Okay? Maybe like, how many of you are grandparents in here? If you're a grandparent, let me see your hand. Don't be bashful, okay? That's a good thing to be a grandparent, right? If you're a grandparent in here, you might become, I hate to use vengeful, that seems, but let's say revenge, when you buy water guns for your grandchildren. And your children say, don't you remember when we used to really just give you fits with those water guns? Yes, I do. I remember that. And why do you think I bought those? It's a little bit of revenge that's there. It's kind of like as a grandparent telling your children, I hope that you have kids like you someday. Isn't that the way right there? We think, a little bit of revenge, right? We think in terms of that one. Well, it really isn't revenge or being all that, but it comes in all shapes and sizes. In fact, to be a little bit more vengeful, maybe it's like a lady in Tennessee a few years back who tested positive with AIDS and then went and slept with 50 men, giving it to them because her boyfriend had done her wrong. And her statement after being arrested was, I just wanted to get revenge for what he did to me. I wanted to get revenge on all of these men for what my boyfriend did to me. Or maybe it's like a lady in Albany who tests positive for coronavirus and then chooses to go to Walmart knowing that she has it. Oh yeah, that's a true statement. Revenge. Vengeance. And so when we think about Samson and wrapping up the idea of the judges, the things that he teaches us really are from his failures in life more than his successes in life. And this section deals with the idea of revenge and really how it doesn't pay off, the futility of revenge. There are three things that I find in these couple of chapters. Chapter 14 and chapter 15 of Judges. And we're not necessarily going to read through any of this. We'll tell the story as we've done before just because of the length of these stories and the amount of time that we're dealing with here. But there are three things specific. There are a few things that fall underneath these as well that I want us to think of in terms of some truth that we learn from Samson's life, particularly as to revenge and maybe, again, what not to do. Here's the first thing that I've noticed when I read through his story is life is seldom fair. Life is seldom fair, isn't it? That's kind of the thing that goes through our mind often. We experience that no matter what. Life is seldom fair. There are things that happen within our lives that we just go, that's just not fair. We've said it before. We said it when we were kids. We said it when we were adults. There are just things that take place in this world, and that really is also what took place in the life of Samson, where he ultimately might say, you know, it's just not fair. It's just not fair. And so, as we begin in chapter 14 and look at some of his, again, life and what takes place there, we jump into maybe the first incident after his growing up here. So maybe the very first incident of his adult life, and it goes against everything that God ever laid out for him specifically. As we get into his adult life, the first thing is that we've got to realize that Samson deliberately went against God and ultimately slapped his parents in the face. Not literally, but figuratively. The Old Testament over and over and over again tells God's people, do not marry outside of the faith. The first thing that Samson does when he reaches a certain age is go to God's enemies, the Philistines, and find him a woman to marry. So he deliberately goes against God's will, and he ultimately slaps his parents in the face. Is what we have here. Do not go outside of the faith to marry, Scripture says. His parents, I think, have probably done the best that they can to raise him according to, as we talked last week, the Nazirite vow. They've made a commitment to God to do the best that they can to raise him according to God's purpose for his life. And one of the things in the Nazirite vow are several. Remember, there were 3 specific things. One of the things, of course, is what? Anybody remember the Nazirite vow? What there was there? Tell me, speak loud.
No one. Don't cut the hair.
Don't cut the hair. Don't touch anything that's dead. What's the other? No drinking of anything from a vine, or eating anything from a vine. Okay? There's the Nazirite vow. That's the vow that Samson's parents had taken for him. That's the vow that he was to take as well. And we find that in everything he's constantly doing just the opposite of anything that God had told him to do. Now, let me ask you this. Anybody in here, is there anybody in here an only child? If you're an only child, let me see. Anybody in here an only child? Okay. All right. Well, Samson's parents had him later in life because his mother was barren. She's unnamed, but it says that she was barren. One day, an angel of the Lord comes to her and says, listen, you're going to have a child later in life. So I suspect, only a suspicion, they did the best that they could, but I'm thinking Samson was a spoiled brat. Now, that's nothing against all of you single, only children or whatever. But I'm thinking that Samson's parents did the best that they could to raise him according to God's purpose. But I'm also thinking because it was later in life that they probably did everything that they could for him. I'm thinking he's probably a little spoiled. Whatever Samson wants, Samson gets. Okay? Remember, they named him Samson. You got to remember from this last week, okay, he's teased constantly because the name Samson means sunshine. All right? You name your son Sunshine, okay? Well, he's going to have to fight everybody around, so it's no wonder he's the strongest guy in the world. He names him Sunshine. And so, Samson, whatever Samson gets, Samson wants. Or whatever he wants, he gets. So there's the first thing. Now, that's just kind of reading between the lines. There's nothing in there that says that. That's just what I'm thinking. Now, here's the thing. The first thing Samson does is go against God's will, and he goes down to Gaza, and he goes to the Philistines, those who were the enemies of God's people, and he finds him a little sweet thing and says, I want to marry her. And he goes back home, and the passage of Scripture says that he goes to his dad, and he says, I found the girl that I want to marry, make it happen. That's what the passage says, make it happen. I think Samson might be a little bit spoiled. It's basically whatever Mama and Daddy give to him, and whatever Samson wants, he gets. And so he goes back to Mom and Dad and says, listen, I found the girl I want to marry, make it happen. Yikes. His dad goes, well, wait a minute, can't you find somebody of our own faith, of our own claim? No, I found the one that I want to marry, make it happen. Spoiled a little? So Manoah goes, yeah, okay, whatever. So Samson already then goes against God's will, and he forces his parents to go against it as well. To go outside of the realm of what they know to be right, make it happen. Well, we recognize this whole setup. A slap in the face to God, a slap in the face to the parents. So, on the first trip down, I don't know where Samson is in this whole thing. A lion comes out of the underbrush and attacks Samson. And he kills it with his bare hands. His parents don't see this happen, and he doesn't tell them. So I'm not sure where he is, whether he's way ahead, whether he's way behind, I don't really know, but they don't see this incident, and he doesn't tell them. They make their way down, arrange the wedding, all of the things that were involved. They go back home. They go down for the wedding on the wedding day. And Samson, as he passes by this place where he has killed this lion, just glances over, checks it out, and he notices that in the rotting carcass of the lion is now a beehive full of honey. And so he goes, scoops up a bunch of honey, eats it himself, and gives it to his parents, and doesn't tell them where it comes from. Now again, he's caused them to sin and go against God. Why? Because part of the Nazarite vow was, don't touch anything that's dead. No matter what. Don't touch anything that's dead. So he himself slaps God in the face, slaps his parents in the face, and causes them also to sin against God. Unknowingly, he knows. They don't. So, the wedding takes place, all that goes on, okay? Samson decides, remember, in this whole thing, this is his first marriage, okay? Samson decides that he's going to tell a riddle, remember? So he rattles off this riddle at the wedding feast. Okay, he's got this riddle. He knows what's in his mind. He rattles off this riddle. You can read through the riddle, okay? And then the wedding takes place, and then all of a sudden, 3 days into this, 3 days, 3 nights into this, the people can't figure out the riddle, all of that, and Samson's new wife, it says within the text, throws herself on him and says, Samson, you don't love me. You hate me. Tell me the riddle. Samson says, I haven't even told the riddle to my parents, the answer to my parents. Why would I tell you? And she bawls and squalls and carries on and does all of that for 7 days. That might get a little irritating, don't you think? At the end of 7 days, he finally says, okay, I've had enough. And he tells the answer to the riddle. And we know then what takes place. She shares it with her countrymen, the Philistines, the enemies of God. And they say in verse 18, as we look at it, but the sun set on the 7th day, the men of the town said to him, what is what? Sweeter than honey, Samson? And what is stronger than a lion? Now, I'm not advocating this next phrase, and I apologize maybe to you ladies. But this is what Samson's reply was. He says, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved the riddle. If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved the riddle. Yikes! I don't advise any of you men to call your wife a heifer. That's probably not the first thing that I would do 7 days after your marriage. But that's what he says. And so, to exact his revenge, he goes out and kills 30 people. 30 men. Takes all their clothes, all their possessions, and brings it back and gives it to those who explained the riddle. Listen carefully, this is what the passage says. Burning with anger, he went up to his father's house, and Samson's wife was given to a friend who had attended him at his wedding. He goes out, kills 30 people, brings all their possessions, gives them, because that's what he told them that he would do. But he became so angry that he just goes to his father's house, and then his brand new wife is given to the best man of the wedding. That's what happened. His brand new wife is taken from him and given to the best man. Do you think that might make you a little mad? You think that might make you a little bit angry? Probably so. It's just not fair. in life? There are certain things that take place in life that just don't seem fair. How many times have we said that along the way? It's just not fair. Well, there are piddly things in our lives that we say it's just not fair. You know, like that creeper in the Walmart parking lot. You know, the creeper that's in the next aisle over whenever they're driving up and you spot that parking spot and you're getting ready to go to it and they whip around from the other side and take your spot. Huh? How many of you know that person? How many of you have been that person, right? Wait a minute, I've been waiting forever for that spot, right? That's just not fair. You just got here and you stole my spot. Right? They say that. It's just not fair, right? We know how that works. Okay. What about, however, when things go beyond just the piddly little things of life? When your health insurance defaults on the day after major surgery. What about the new employee that gets hired as a favor to a friend who steals your position at work? What about you lose your job simply because of corporate politics? What about your husband runs off with your best friend? What about your child is born with mental or physical handicaps that are going to plague them the rest of their life? What about setting aside watching your aging parents succumb to Alzheimer's disease? What about losing that family member to tragedy? Life isn't fair, is it? It's just not fair. We know we struggle with it every single day, trying to make sense of it all. There's a truth in Samson's life. And although he spent most of his adult life trying to get revenge, I think he probably recognized life just really isn't fair. That's tough to deal with. There's a second point that I want us to know. And that is, revenge is seldom sweet. Revenge is seldom sweet. Life just isn't fair. In Samson's case, obviously his new wife swindled the riddle's answer out, and then she's given to the best man. Life just didn't seem all that fair for him at this point. Well, why? Partly because he'd gone against the will of God in that case. But then he burns with even more anger and really sets out to get revenge, and yet revenge is seldom sweet. You know, we have the old expression, I don't get mad, I get what? Even. I don't get mad, I get even. It's an attitude and a spirit that begins to drive us in our lives. There's a wonderful book out, and it's been made into a movie as well several years ago. It's written back in the 1800s. The Count of Monte Cristo. Remember the name? Many of you probably remember it. It's a great book. And the title character, the main character, is Edmond Dantes. Edmond Dantes, and he's been imprisoned for something he did not do. He was innocent of, and he spends a fair amount of his adult life in prison. and his cellmate, his good friend in prison, eventually dies, and Edmund Dantes, escapes from prison. And the movie consists then of him searching for the treasure of Monte Cristo. And he finds it. And the companion that is with him, when he finds it, he kind of slaps him on the back, and then the whole idea is like, you are the richest man I have ever known. You are the wealthiest man. You've just found this treasure. What are you going to do with this treasure? One word comes out of his mouth. Revenge. Revenge. His entire life, yes, he had been in prison for something he didn't do. He was an innocent man. But he was consumed with revenge. Revenge, however, is seldom sweet. See, if you go to Judges 15, if you're in that, and you look at verse 3. At this point, Samson's motives kind of come into play after that point. His new wife turned against him. Now she's been given away. Obviously, that's not fair. But Samson says in chapter 15, verse 3, this time I have a right to get even with the Philistines. I will really harm them. Revenge. So he goes out and captures 300 foxes, ties their tails together with a torch in the middle, and turns them loose in their harvest-ready fields. Jacob, how do you like to have that happen? Corn's in great shape, everything looks good, and all of a sudden your neighbor goes out and catches 300 foxes and lights their tails on fire and sets them loose out in your field. Think that's going to go over real well? Yikes. But that's what happens. But in his mind it was this. This time I have a reason. I will get back at them. He burns with that anger. And so now he's done that. He's destroyed their crops. Guess what? The Philistines turn tails, saying, you know what? You did that, we're going to do something. Okay. So he goes to his father-in-law's house, and he sets his father-in-law's house on fire and kills his father-in-law, all of the family, including his new wife. Burns them to death. Back and forth, back and forth. You see, revenge is seldom sweet because it's never going to end, no matter what. When you think you've gotten back at the other guy's going to come back and get you. It's just going to happen. And this is back and forth and back and forth. And here's what happens. After the Philistines literally burned the house of Samson's father-in-law, his wife kills every one of them. Then Samson says in verse 7, since you have acted this way, I won't stop until I get my revenge on you. See how this just keeps building and building and building? So, Samson just keeps getting... He goes and lives in a cave, and his own countrymen, the Israelites, come to him. And here's something that I want you to get out of this. There are two things that stand out when I really read this story, and here's what it is. Samson acted in such a way that the men of his own country didn't recognize him as a leader from God. Samson acted in a way that the men of his own country, God's people, didn't recognize him as a leader from God. Remember, he's a judge. He has been put in place by God to lead these people, to judge these people, to free them from the Philistines, but he acted in such a way that even his own people didn't recognize him as a leader from God. I wonder, is that what's taking place in our churches of today? Do we act in such a way that the world around us doesn't even see us as people of God? Are we trying the best that we can to revenge something, to get vengeance back on something, when God simply says what? Vengeance is mine, right? It's not yours, it's mine. It seems sweet, but it's seldom sweet. It seems that way. But Samson acted in such a way that even the people around him couldn't tell that he was a leader from God. I wonder if the world looks at us and really can tell the difference based on how we act, what we say, where we go, what we do. But as I said at the very beginning of this, in spite of everything that Samson did wrong, God still used him. In spite of everything and all of his failures and every time that he went against God, God still used him. In the end, the Philistines were destroyed. In the end, God's people were freed. In the end, it says that Samson judged them for 20 years. God still used him, even though he was far from perfect. That's the advantage, the blessing that we have. We know we don't have to be perfect. Why? Because we know we won't be perfect. But we also recognize we need to do the best that we can to follow God's will. But God will get His purpose done, His plan done. We can make a difference, even though we may fail miserably. We can influence. We can impact. We can make a difference. Revenge seems like a sweet proposition. We want everything and everybody to be equal. We want everybody to be treated the same. When we seek revenge, it never seems to work out. I'll tell you this true story. We're going to wrap this up here really pretty quick. But I want to tell you this true story. Husband and wife. Husband just got a brand new job. Been kind of struggling. Went out, got a new job. Was late the very first day on the job. But let me tell you why. He was late because his wife didn't set the alarm. Let me think about this just a little bit. Are you an adult here? He was late because his wife didn't set the alarm, and they got into an argument. And the argument got severe and heated enough that the husband went and got a gun and shot his wife in the arm. This is a true story. Shot his wife in the arm. Well, he wasn't wanting to be outdone, so she went and got a gun, shot him in the arm. So now they got to call, and eventually they lose enough blood they pass out. EMTs take him to the hospital. Husband wakes up first, then the wife. This is a true story, by the way. I'm telling you, this would make a wonderful country and western song. Okay? Keith, we got to work on this. All right? This is going to make a wonderful country and western. How many of you like country and western? The only thing that would make this better is a dog. Okay? That's just it. This really is a true story. They're laying two separate stretchers side by side here in the pre-op unit. The husband leans up, looks over at his wife and says, "I love you, baby. I'm sorry I shot you." What? That's okay, honey. I'm sorry I shot you too. This is a perfect country and western song. The only thing that made this better based on somebody in the first service was the fact that the pot of coffee wasn't made, okay? She forgot to make the coffee. Really? Can you imagine something like that happening in your home? Really? You forgot to set the alarm. Well, I'm just going to shoot you. Well, guess what? I'm going to shoot you too. Oh, I really love you, dear. I'm sorry I shot you. Really? I'm thinking this is, I'm going to send this in. Somebody can make a great, great country and western song out of it. Revenge is seldom sweet. Have you ever tasted saccharine? That stuff you put in your tea to make it sweet. Have you ever tasted it by itself? The first taste is sweet. The second taste is bitter, extremely. The third taste, you can't hardly stand it. The more you taste it, the worse it gets. to the point where it'll make you sick. It's so bitter. It seems good. The first one is sweet, but it is nasty stuff. Samson and the Philistines suffered great losses, both of them, when they tried to even the score. I'm telling you, when you try to even the score, it isn't going to work out for you. It isn't going to work out. The last of this is this. In all of his failures, God was always faithful. God was always faithful. In everything that was wrong, God remained faithful. Knowing that Samson would turn against him, knowing that he would always do the wrong thing, it would appear. It's kind of an interesting thing. That even at his death, Samson was still thinking about revenge. Remember, Samson finds another woman, Delilah, married, whatever. She wants to know, eventually coaxes him out of his strength. He gets captured. We know all of that. Cuts the hair, part of the Nazirite vow, gets all of that. Philistines take his eyes out, blind him. Okay? Literally burn his eyes out. And in the last act of Samson's life, we remember, the Philistines are having this great party, this huge feast. There are over 3,000 of them that gathered in this temple area. And they say, "Bring out Samson to entertain us." You remember, they lead him out, he entertains them. But he asks the little boy who's leading them to place his hands on the pillars. And he finishes with revenge still in his mind. Again, still going against the will of God. He prays, but his prayer is, "God, let me get my revenge on them for them taking my eyes out. Let me die with them, but I want to get revenge." God grants the prayer, not necessarily for Samson's sake, but for the nation of Israel's sake. He kills over 3,000 of them in one act, which was more than he killed in his entire lifetime, and frees the people of God again from the enemies, the Philistines. The end of the section says Samson judged them for 20 years. And that was the end of the judges. These three things are what we'll finish with. First, remember this, you can't get even. No matter what you do, you can't get even. You might think that your revenge will be sweet and that you can't get even. And we need to remember then to focus on a loving God, a serving God, and a pleasing God. When you want to try to even the score with someone else, that's the best time to focus on God. To invest yourself in God. Stop trying to exact your revenge. Yes, life is seldom sweet and fair. You can't get even. In this world that we live in, you and I are destined for destruction. In this world. Unless the Lord returns, you and I will die. We are destined for destruction. How are you planning for the next world? How are you planning for the next life? That really is the question in the life of Samson, in what he teaches us. Life isn't fair, we know it. God never said this life is going to be easy. He never said it was going to be fair. In fact, He said just the opposite. This world that we live in is going to continually get worse. That's biblical. I'm not trying to be negative. I'm just trying to tell you what Scripture says. The world in which we live in is going to continually get worse. How are you planning for the next world? What are we doing to set ourselves up for the world to come? Samson failed miserably. But even in his failure, God actually saw him as a great man of faith. Samson's listed in Hebrews 11. With the great men and women of faith that are mentioned, his name is there. In all of the things that he did wrong, God still saw him as a man of faith. God is faithful. You and I have lived lives that we really aren't proud of. We've done things we don't want anybody else to know about. We're probably not going to say to anybody. We have failed God, we've failed ourselves, we've failed our family, just like Samson did. We've failed miserably, but yet God says, as Jeremy said earlier, I have a plan. My plan is that my son will come and take your place. My plan is that I'll give my son so that you might have an opportunity, a chance, a hope to get beyond the misery of this life to the glory of the next. It's not automatic. There's still part of what we have to do. There's still that acknowledging who Jesus is. There's still that confessing the fact that He is who He is. There's still repentance that comes to take place. There's still baptism that has to happen. And then there's the ability to try to live as faithfully as we can in our lives. That's part of Scripture. We're destined for destruction. What are we doing to plan for the next life? That's what you have to decide. As Keith leads us in this song, is a great song. Great are you, Lord. We acknowledge His greatness. We also need to acknowledge our sin. Turn it over to Him. Give it to Him.